mic check here. Just to get everybody started, it's about time for our presentation on the life of Paul Robeson to begin. Would like to welcome everyone here and remind you to silence your cell phones, please. You could turn them off, or you can put them on airplane mode. I will attempt my best to remember to remind people at the end of our event to take it off of airplane mode, because I once, after one of these presentations, because I put mine on airplane mode, it was 2 days later, and I wondered why I hadn't heard from someone, and then I realized for the last 2 days it was on airplane mode, and it was, anyway. So I'll try my best to remind you to turn it off of airplane mode. We would like to thank the Greenville County Library for sponsoring this event, the Tuesday talks, and on the back table there are some of the materials that relate to the person who's being discussed here tonight. So if you'd like to pick up video or books, they're available for checkout. If you don't have a library card, you should definitely get yourself a library card. What a deal. And once you have your library card, I was surprised to discover you can actually just use your driver's license and check out a book that way. If they have you in the file, you can check it out if you didn't happen to have your library card on you. Let me see. Oh, that's what I'm holding in my hand. Right here, there was a change in our original schedule. Last month, we were going to have a presentation about Edgar Allan Poe. But because of the weather, that's when the snows hit. So we changed it, and the new date will be May the 19th, okay? Let's see. I think we're going to have a talk in March about Captain Henry Felder, and then in April, a talk about Mother Jones, and then at the beginning of May, a talk about Rebecca Mott, the the Revolutionary War heroine from Charleston. And then we will have Edgar Allan Poe, who revolutionized American literature. We will have his presentation on May the 19th. So it's in this publication that just came out from the library. And we invite everyone to be involved because, you know, Chautauqua was all about being involved, talking to the performers, talking to the presenters and all that. We have some postcards over there, some stickers over there, some cards, all this stuff I'm juggling in my hands right here that is free. We encourage you to send out word about Chautauqua to friends and neighbors that you think might be interested. People who live in the area, or people, hey, if they live in California but they want to see Edgar Allan Poe, tell them, come on down. We've got him on the stage. So, with all that said, on with tonight's presentation. Tonight's speaker teaches at Furman, where she is the William Montgomery Professor of History Emeritus. She is a graduate of Mount Holyoke College, and she earned her PhD from Duke. She was named the Southern Conference Faculty Member of the Year, as well as earning the Meritorious Teaching Award. She is the former chair of the History Department at Furman, as well as the former chair of faculty at Furman. She specializes in recent U.S. history, modern European history, African American history, and American women's history. And I'll just put in as a sidebar, for many years she has served on the board of the Greenville Chautauqua. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Marion Strobel.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out on the night of the President's State of the Union address. I will try to be, we'll try to get through this in time so that you can get home and listen to what he has to say, although I think my speech might be better, but that's just what I'm saying here. All right, well, when I say the name Paul Robeson, I often receive a blank stare. Then I ponder, what has happened that so many people no longer recognize the name of a prominent African-American concert artist who was also an actor, a professional football player, a lawyer, and a civil rights activist? plus a man who got entangled in the mid-20th century Red Scare. Without a doubt, it is the latter aspect of Robeson's career and life that helped erase him from much of public memory. As we will see, during the early years of the Cold War, this talented and often controversial man would eventually find himself ostracized by those who at first had most promoted his career, as well as by a government terrified by Soviet Russia and the possible spread of communist ideology to America's shores. So who exactly was Paul Robeson, and what forces helped shape him? Paul Leroy Robeson was born on April 9th, 1898, in Princeton, New Jersey. He was the youngest of 5 children. He was the son of the Reverend William and Maria Louisa Robeson. His father was a runaway slave who had escaped his plantation home in North Carolina in his teens. He served as a laborer for the Union Army during the Civil War, somehow learned to read and write, and went on to attend all-black Lincoln University outside of Philadelphia, where he received both his undergraduate and his theological degrees. By 1879, William Robeson had worked his way up to be named pastor of Witherspoon Baptist Church in Princeton, Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church, in New Jersey, the most prestigious of the African-American churches in Princeton. Paul Robeson's mother, Maria Louisa, was the daughter of prominent free black Quakers from Philadelphia who had once been active in abolitionist circles. Maria Louisa had also attended Lincoln University, where she met her husband. She had worked for a time as a Quaker school teacher and tutor. She was, interestingly enough, 45 at the time of Paul's birth. His father was 53, so these are older parents. Well, not long after Paul was born, prominent white financial supporters of his father's church began to object to William Robeson's accounting practices, especially his spending of church money on the poor and the indigent. Also a matter of concern were his protests against racist Jim Crow practices in Princeton. They weren't just in the South. The Reverend Robeson was forced to resign from his pulpit despite the opposition of 77 members of his congregation who signed a petition on behalf of their beloved pastor. Their loyalty did no good. It would be another decade before William Robeson would find another stable pulpit, this time at St. Thomas AME Zion Church in Somerville, New Jersey. In the meantime, the family lived in penury. What made matters worse was that when Paul was only 6, his mother, who was nearly blind at that point, died from burns in a cooking fire. Such family tragedies were not the most auspicious start for someone who would come to eventually be called the best-known American in the world. As Paul Robeson's older siblings went off to college to prepare for professional careers in such fields as medicine or the ministry, Paul spent many years living alone with his father. Reverend Robeson was a man of great dignity and Christian warmth, and he taught his son to care for all people who are unfairly treated. He was a loving and demanding father with perfectionist standards. This meant that he expected Paul to do family chores, participate in the life of the church, work outside jobs to pay for school fees, and to be a superb student. Paul readily complied. He entered Somerville High School in 1912. He was one of 12 black students out of an enrollment of 200. Somerville was not as racist as Princeton. Paul came to be liked at Somerville High and had white friends. He studied hard and participated in amateur theatrical and musical activities. His voice was bass baritone in range and highly regarded for its richness. Paul was often overly modest about his abilities in the arts. He learned from his father the lesson that would foretell much of what would happen in his life. And this lesson was, quote, "Do nothing to give them cause to fear you, for then the oppressing hand, which might at times ease up a little, will surely become a fist to knock you down again." Interesting comment. Although Paul was a splendid singer, he never allowed himself to brag about his talents. But it was acceptable to visibly excel in the athletic field. Paul played baseball, basketball, and ran track. Most importantly, he was a splendid football player, as you can see there, and also an exceptional student. During his senior year in high school, Paul took a statewide written exam for a scholarship to Rutgers University, the flagship of the New Jersey Fleet. He won the competition. As he later explained, equality might be denied, but I knew I was not inferior. In late 1915, Paul Robeson became the third African-American student ever enrolled at Rutgers. He immediately tried out for the Scarlet Knights football team. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed about 200 pounds. He was determined to make the squad, despite some opposition because he was black. His potential teammates at first engaged in such physical play that his nose got broken and his shoulder got dislocated. However, Paul persevered and made the team. Interesting. During his sophomore year, he found himself benched because Washington Lee University of Virginia came to Rutgers for a football game and refused to play with an African American. So Paul did not play. Now later on, William and Mary, and I know we have one William and Mary graduate here in the room, and Georgia Tech wouldn't even travel to New Jersey if a black man was on the Rutgers squad. But Paul did not let that bigotry affect his performance on the football field. He served as an end during his junior and senior years, and he won All-American honors. He also distinguished himself as a center on the basketball team, a catcher on the baseball team, and as a competent javelin and discus thrower on the track team. Imagine that. One national college coach in the know referred to Paul as a veritable Superman. Paul was such a great athlete that during his college career, he won 12 letters for his athletic feats. At the same time, he was a member of the Rutgers debate team, and to earn extra money, sang at events off campus. He was elected to Phi Beta Kappa for his academic achievements, and senior year was named class valedictorian. In his valedictory address, Paul boldly told his classmates to work for equality for all. Again, this at the time of the height of Jim Crow in America. He closed his remarks saying that, quote, "I appeal to you to fight for an ideal government where black and white shall clasp friendly hands in the consciousness of the fact that we are all brethren and that God is the Father of us all." According to one source, the crowd roared its approval. Paul's father, unfortunately, was not at the graduation. He had fallen ill and died during Paul's junior year in college. At that terrible time, Paul had been able to commute between Rutgers and Somerville to care for his father before his passing. It's about 30 miles. At the time of his death, Reverend Robeson was in his mid-70s. Paul Robeson started out at New York University Law School in the fall of 1919. He also became an assistant football coach at Lincoln University to help support himself. Robeson was not happy at NYU. He soon moved uptown to Harlem and enrolled at Columbia University Law School for the spring term of 1920. Known for his singing, especially among the black community, Robeson began to participate in off-Broadway productions as part of the chorus. Astonishingly, at the same time, he played for the National Football League's Akron Pros and later for their Milwaukee Badgers, and still somehow remained in law school. His football career ended in 1922. Paul graduated from Columbia Law School in 1923. 2 years before, he had married Islanda. Here he is, Rutgers graduation. Here he is as a law student. He had married Islanda Essie Good, a fellow student at Columbia, who was an anthropologist and a chemist, among other professions. She would become Paul's longtime collaborator and manager, and sometimes source of financial support. The marriage would last for over 40 years, cut short only by Essie's passing. Paul Robeson worked briefly as a lawyer after finishing at Columbia. He quickly discovered that the profession was not one that he enjoyed. In late 1924, Robeson, drawn more to theater than to the law, landed the role of Brutus in Emperor Jones, a Broadway play by Eugene O'Neill. What was remarkable is that the play called for basically a 90-minute soliloquy on the part of Robeson. Reviews were splendid and much stronger than For All God's Children, in which Robeson also appeared. In the meantime, Essie Robeson quit her job as a chemist in surgical pathology at a New York hospital and became her husband's agent. She negotiated his first movie role, a silent race film called Body and Soul. Paul also began to sing, first for charity events and then for professional concerts. His work often combined African-American folk songs with spirituals. Also doing that would be the African-American woman composer Florence Price, I might add. But indeed, throughout his life, Paul Robeson would promote African-American spirituals as a serious musical form. His accompanist for over 40 years was Lawrence Benjamin Brown, himself a composer of spirituals. Robeson signed a contract with Victor Records in 1925. Unfortunately, that's Columbia. I couldn't find a record cover with Victor on it. But anyways, there's a record. It was his wife, Essie, who eagerly pushed forward her husband's career. She placed him in the right social circles in New York, and throughout his life would be his most enthusiastic supporter, despite his numerous extramarital affairs. Soon the Robesons traveled to London for a revival of Emperor Jones. They then headed to the French Riviera, where they socialized with such 1920s celebrities as Gertrude Stein and Claude McKay. In 1927, with Essie in New York, Paul toured Europe as part of a concert tour. While he was abroad, he learned that Essie had given birth to their son, Paul Robeson Jr. He rushed home when he heard that Essie had suffered serious complications at the time of the baby's birth. Luckily, she recuperated from them. Paul Jr. would be an only child. In 1928, Robeson played Joe in the London production of the American musical Showboat by Oscar Hammerstein II. As one source has explained, Robeson's rendition of Old Man River became the benchmark for all future performers of the song. A special honor for Paul was a Royal Command performance at Buckingham Palace. With their London success, the Robesons purchased a home in Hampstead, an exclusive neighborhood in North London. Pretty snazzy house, I would say. After a brief sojourn in Switzerland, the Robesons returned to London, where Paul starred as Othello with Peggy Ashcroft playing Desdemona. An affair ensued. Peggy was white. At that point, Essie decided, and so did Paul, to seek a divorce, and a temporary split ensued. Meanwhile, multitasking as usual, Paul became one of the first artists to record at what would later become Abbey Road Studios, later famous for its recordings of Beatles albums. In 1932, Robeson returned to New York and Broadway to repeat his performance as Joe in Showboat. His old football coach advised Paul not to divorce Essie or to marry Peggy, as doing so would be disastrous for his reputation. The affair was broken off in 1932, and a reconciliation of husband and wife took place, despite permanent scars to the marriage. In the 1930s, the Robesons traveled back and forth between the United States and London for various theater and movie roles, including Brutus in Emperor Jones, and this was the movie version, the first film ever to feature an African American as the star. Feeling more comfortable in England than in the land of his birth, Robeson began to publicly criticize fellow African Americans in the United States, who he felt were rejecting their own culture, which he firmly believed they should embrace. He announced that no longer would he accept singing roles that had no connection to his heritage. To add action to his words, Robeson enrolled in the School of Oriental and African Studies as part of the University of London. He studied phonetics and Swahili. Doing so was part of Robeson's desire to embrace his African ancestry. By the 1930s, Robeson had developed numerous friendships among British socialists and with those in anti-imperialist circles. The world of the Robeson family was broadening. Paul and Essie traveled to the Soviet Union upon a 1934 invitation from the Russian film director Sergei Eisenstein. A stopover on the way to Moscow took place in Berlin, and Robeson became enlightened regarding the racism of Germany and the Nazi regime. Upon arriving in the Soviet Union, Robeson said, "Here I am not a Negro, but a human being for the first time in my life. I walk in full human dignity." In the midst of all these activities, Paul Robeson developed a friendship with Albert Einstein, who he first met in 1935 when Robeson came backstage after one of Robeson's performances in New Jersey. Both men discussed their mutual love of music and hatred of fascism. The friendship lasted until Einstein's death in 1955. In 1936, the Robesons made the momentous decision to send their son, Paul Jr., to school in the Soviet Union. They did so to shield him from racist attitudes in the United States. By the way, he was in 5th grade, and Essie's mother stayed with him in the Soviet Union, in case you're wondering about that. Paul would remain there for several years, but he would eventually return to the United States to attend high school and college. He graduated from Cornell, by the way. With his son in Moscow and his hatred of fascism, Paul Robeson Sr. became deeply affected by the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. Robeson would always assert it was the Spanish Civil War that transformed him into a political activist. He traveled to Spain, raised money for the Republican cause, and became outspoken about his beliefs. Robeson soon supported the movement for the independence of India as well. He hosted Nehru in his London home and also advocated for African nationalism, meaning political independence from European control. As Robeson himself put it, quote, "The artist must take sides. He must elect to fight for freedom or slavery. I have made my choice. I have no alternative." Robeson's last British film was The Proud Valley, that was still being shot in September 1939 at the time of Hitler's invasion of Poland that began World War II. As soon as the film wrapped, the Robesons quickly headed back to the United States, first settling in Harlem and then in Enfield, Connecticut. In the following years, Paul Robeson did live radio performances and concert tours. A huge problem was accommodations, as many hotels would not host African Americans as guests. This included the famous Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles that said it would only accommodate Robeson for an exorbitant fee and only if he registered under an assumed name. In retaliation, Robeson decided to dedicate every 2 hours every afternoon of his stay to sitting in the hotel lobby to publicize his presence there. So this was a sign. Guess what? Eventually, Los Angeles hotels lifted their racial restrictions on black guests. In 1942, Robeson narrated a documentary called Native Land that the FBI later labeled as communist propaganda. It was actually about the struggle of labor unions and the bosses the bosses in corporations that hated labor unions. So that's why the FBI didn't like it. Well, after that film, Robeson announced that he would no longer act in films as the only ones available to blacks were demeaning and unacceptable. So during the years of World War II, and especially after the German invasion of Russia, Robeson urged African Americans to support the U.S. war effort. His hatred of fascism led him to believe that an Allied defeat would make slaves of us all. He appeared in benefit concerts to aid the Allied cause. In 1943, Robeson reprised his role as Othello in the Shubert Theater in New York. The production ran for 296 performances on Broadway, a record for a Shakespeare play. And in an attempt to break racial barriers, Robeson also made a plea to Major League Baseball owners to integrate their teams. This would not happen until 1947 with Jackie Robinson, of course. Paul Robeson was also concerned about the fate of China. He supported the Chinese in their war against Japan in the late 1930s and gave concerts to promote their cause. One was planned for Constitution Hall in Washington, but guess what? It was blocked by the Daughters of the American Revolution due to Robeson's race. This situation echoed that of Marian Anderson, 1939. Basically, Robeson opposed American support for the rabid anti-communist Chiang Kai-shek, as he believed that due to internal conflicts, the Chinese could not put their full efforts into combating Japanese aggression. By the late 1940s, of course, Chiang and the nationalists were exiled to Taiwan. Meanwhile, Robeson's song, March of the Volunteers, recorded first in the United States during the war years, became the national anthem of the Communist People's Republic of China, led by Mao Zedong. During the post-World War II era, Paul Robeson founded the American Crusade against lynching in 1946. He did so in response to an upsurge in lynching in the American South after the war. Also of concern to Robeson were the rights of the laboring masses, as was shown in that earlier movie. He believed that trade union membership was key to the civil rights progress, and he became a pro-labor activist. Further, after 1945, Robeson associated with numerous Communist Party members, some of whom were labor union activists. This was a dangerous strategy during the years of the Cold War. When called up by the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary and asked if he himself was a Communist Party member, Robeson refused to answer and replied, quote, "Some of the most brilliant and distinguished Americans are about to go to jail for the failure to answer that question, and I am going to join them if necessary." In 1948, here we are, Social Crusader. In 1948, Robeson became a prominent member of Henry Wallace's liberal bid for the presidency on the third-party Progressive Party ticket. Wallace, a former vice president and secretary of agriculture, was a strong New Dealer who was highly critical of U.S. actions during the early years of the Cold War. Robeson tried his hardest to assist the Wallace campaign. He did so by campaigning for Wallace in the Deep South, certainly a dangerous and even foolhardy activity, as few blacks could vote in the region until the mid-1960s. Despite Robeson's efforts, Harry Truman, of course, won re-election. Due to his actions supporting less than savory causes, Robeson soon discovered that most of his concert performances were canceled at the FBI's behest. So in 1949, he headed to Europe to go on tour. While there, Robeson spoke before the World Peace Council. A false transcript of his remarks was published, thereby giving the impression that Robeson equated the United States with a fascist government. We now think J. Edgar Hoover wrote that document. that was attributed to Robeson. Back home in the United States, though, Robeson did not help his case when he publicly advocated in favor of 12 Communist Party defendants who were charged with violating the 1940s Smith Act that prohibited talk to promote the overthrow of the US government. In 1949, Robeson traveled to Moscow, and despite evidence to the contrary, Robeson denied that any persecution existed in the Soviet Union, certainly a lie. In June 1949, Robeson spoke at the Paris Peace Congress. In referring to both black and white workers from around the world, he stated, quote, "We reject any hysterical raving that urges us to make war on anyone. Our will to fight for peace is strong. We shall not make war on anyone. We shall not make war on the Soviet Union." The mainstream press blacklisted Robeson for such a statement, and so did many African-American periodicals, including those not known for their conservative views. The House Un-American Activities Committee, in an attempt to silence Robeson, immediately called up such luminaries as baseball player Jackie Robinson and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to comment on Robeson's remarks that he had made at the Paris Peace Conference. Both were critical of what Robeson had said and implied that he had hurt his race by appearing to line them up on the side of communists. Days after the congressional hearing, a concert by Robeson in New York City was condemned by the local press. The Peekskill riots, and you can see the picture there, occurred in Cortlandt Manor, New York, in late August 1949. Protests shut down a Robeson concert, and 140 people were injured. Communists were blamed for the melee. In fact, it was caused by those who objected to Robeson's reputation as a supporter of trade unions, civil rights, anti-colonialism, and of course his possible communist affiliation and communist friendships. This began the official blacklisting and erasure from public view. Robeson's name was omitted from the most authoritative guide to college football. He no longer appeared as ever having played on the Rutgers football team or of having won All-American football honors. National networks canceled Robeson's appearance on television shows. When Robeson opposed US involvement in the Korean War, its nuclear threats against China, and his continued advocacy for the independence of peoples of Africa from European control, the US State Department took action. At the request of the FBI, Paul Robeson's passport was revoked, and he could no longer leave the country and earn his usual overseas fees for his concert performances. This meant that Robeson's income dropped precipitously, from $150,000 a year to less than $3,000. Officially, Robeson was told that his criticism of the treatment of black Americans in the US had become too inflammatory and should not be aired in foreign countries. In the early 1950s, Paul Robeson, along with black activist and author W.E.B. Du Bois, repeatedly demanded the restoration of Robeson's passport and called for leading African-American organizations to support this request. In response, some in the mainline African-American community disparaged Robeson's reputation and at the same time denounced the Communist Party of the United States. We now believe that, again, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, and the State Department were in league with such efforts. Robeson, though, kept on with his attack against racial conditions in the United States. In December 1951, he presented the United Nations with a Civil Rights Congress petition that argued because of its failure to act against lynching, the United States was guilty of genocide. The United Nations took no action. Robeson's pleas were pretty much ignored elsewhere as well, probably as a result of the Red Scare that was now in full flower. In 1952, Robeson was awarded the International Stalin Prize by the Soviet Union. Since he could not travel out of the country, Robeson accepted the award in New York City. Upon Joseph Stalin's death in early 1953, Robeson wrote a tribute to the late dictator, commenting on his humanity and desire for peace and world harmony. Huh? I don't get it. Needless to say, such actions did nothing to restore Robeson's passport to him. He did, however, continue to sing. He and labor union friends even organized several concerts in 1952 and 1953 that took place at the International Peace Arch on the border between Washington State and British Columbia. So he literally stood on the bridge and gave this concert. On June 12, 1956, Paul Robeson was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. This occurred after he refused to sign an affidavit affirming that he was not a communist. Robeson attempted to read a prepared statement into the congressional record, but he was not allowed to do so. Robeson then invoked the Fifth Amendment and declined to reveal his political affiliations. When asked why he had not remained in the Soviet Union since he admired it so much, Robeson replied, quote, "Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build the United States, and I am going to stay here and have a part in it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it." Pretty strong statement to say to Congress. Such words were not intended to make friends. Due in large part to Robeson's performance at the House Un-American Activities Committee hearing, his recordings and films were removed from public distribution, and he was condemned in the press. It became near impossible to hear Robeson on the radio, to purchase his recordings, or to see his movies. Yet in 1957, he sang for a London audience at St. Pancras Town Hall via the recently completed transatlantic telephone cable. Several months later, he repeated the performance for an audience in Wales. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev denounced Joseph Stalin and his actions before the Soviet Politburo. Stalin, of course, as I said, had died 3 years before. With his hero falling out of favor, Robeson would say no more publicly about Stalin, but he did continue to praise the Soviet Union. He even applauded the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956 after that brave nation attempted to rebel against its Russian overlords. Meanwhile, Robeson worked on what has been termed a manifest autobiography titled Here I Stand, and here it is in the flesh, published in 1958. No major publications in the United States reviewed the work. Silence reigned in terms of reviews, and even the African American press was somewhat reluctant to review this book. But it did have some reviews, which it published with trepidation. It was not until 1958 that Paul Robeson's passport was finally restored. It was the result of an unrelated 5-4 Supreme Court decision. Robeson was elated and immediately headed abroad, where he embarked on a performance tour that included starring in Othello in Stratford-upon-Avon in England, singing in Moscow, and spending time with Nikita Khrushchev in Yalta, and partaking in a service at St. Paul's Cathedral back in London. Whoops. There we go. In 1960, he embarked on a 2-month concert tour of Australia and New Zealand. While there, Robeson reaffirmed his support for Marxism-Leninism, denounced the inequality of the Maori people of New Zealand, and demanded full citizen rights for the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. From there, Robeson returned to England and then expressed a desire to head back to the United States to participate in the civil rights movement that was in full swing in the early 1960s. Wife Essie, ever Paul's companion, felt it would be unsafe for him to do so. Also, he probably would be unable to make money due to the government's harassment. Essie won that argument. Instead, the Robesons headed to Moscow once again. While in Russia, Paul Robeson suffered from what can only be described as a complete mental collapse that included extreme paranoia and a suicide attempt. Historian Martin Duberman has written that Robeson's symptoms probably resulted from emotional and physical stress, bipolar depression, exhaustion, and the beginning of circulatory and health problems. Son Paul, who rushed to Moscow, felt that his father's illness was due to the CIA's attempts to neutralize his father through secret mind control. Who knows? But most now doubt it. Robeson was institutionalized in Moscow and then in London, where he again became suicidal. He underwent electric shock and drug therapy. Finally, friends had Robeson transferred to a clinic in East Berlin, where he was given psychotherapy and less medication. According to all reports, Robeson rapidly improved and returned to the United States in December 1963. He would remain here for the rest of his life, much of which was spent in seclusion due to health problems. Upon Robeson's arrival in the United States, Bayard Rustin and James Farmer, key players in the civil rights movement, contacted him about possibly becoming involved in the civil rights crusade. But they insisted that to do so, he would have to denounce communism and all that it stood for. Robeson refused, although he did make a few public appearances to promote the civil rights cause. But bad health was increasingly an issue. Wife Essie died of breast cancer in December 1965. After her passing, Paul moved to New York with his son Paul and his wife, who was white, by the way, and then in 1968 moved permanently to his sister Marion Forsythe's home in Philadelphia. Gradually, Paul Robeson emerged from the haze of being officially erased. A few celebrations were held to honor him, including one at Carnegie Hall in 1973 on the occasion of Robeson's 75th birthday. But he was too ill to attend. And this is the article from the New York Times about the celebration. In the following years after his 75th birthday, Robeson pretty much lived as a recluse, and few saw him. On January 23, 1976, Paul Robeson died in Philadelphia at the age of 77, following complications of a stroke. He lay in state in Harlem. His funeral was held at his brother Ben's former parish, Mother AMI Zion Church, where loudspeakers blared his voice, singing spirituals and other well-known songs, including Old Man River. Here's an article about the funeral. Robeson was laid to rest at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. And there's his stone. In the years after his death, Paul Robeson has been honored in a variety of ways. In 1978, his efforts to end apartheid in South Africa were posthumously recognized by the United Nations General Assembly. A documentary film tribute to Robeson won an Emmy Award in 1980. In 1995, he was named to the College Football Hall of Fame, so he got back in. On the 100th anniversary of Robeson's birth, he was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Grammy Award. Streets and institutes, both in the United States and around the world, have been named in his honor. So too has been the main campus of the University of Rutgers University, Camden, and also an open-air plaza at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. The Paul Robeson House and Museum on Walnut Street in Philadelphia, where Robeson spent his last years with his sister, today celebrates his legacy. Not to be outdone, the Soviet Union in 1978 named a 40,000-ton tanker in Robeson's honor. And more recently, they named a dark red heritage tomato. And back in the United States, most amazing of all was the decision by the United States Postal Service in 2004 to issue a 37-cent stamp to commemorate Paul Robeson. Will wonders never cease? So eventually, Paul Robeson moved from being a pariah to being honored on a postage stamp. What is stunning to me is Paul Robeson's courage in speaking out about those wrongs that he witnessed throughout his life, be it racism, intolerance, fascism, imperialism, or threats to world peace. Often his role was a solitary voice of opposition to prevailing norms, especially during the dark days of the Red Scare in the United States. Most of us cannot fully comprehend why Robeson was so enamored of the Soviet Union, although he did believe that his race was treated better there than in the land of his birth. But I think what is important to remember about Paul Robeson are his many talents and how he often used them to promote equality for African Americans and other oppressed peoples in many spheres of life, in athletics, the arts, and human rights. At times, Robeson was a lonely voice calling out in the wilderness, a man who created a political firestorm and paid the price for doing so. He asked tough questions about the world around him and would not willingly be silenced. In the views of some historians, Robeson paved the way for the likes of Martin Luther King Jr. and perhaps Malcolm X. In the words of biographer Gerald Horne, quote, "It was only with Robeson's fall that King and Malcolm could emerge as they did. The undermining of Robeson created a vacuum that these two leaders filled." An interesting thought, isn't it? Clearly, Paul Robeson was the artist as revolutionary, book by Gerald Horne. In my mind, for all that he was and did, Robeson fits well with Greenville Chautauqua's 2026 series, Revolutionary Americans. I hope that you agree. Let me end with Robeson's own words. Quote, "To be free, to walk the good American earth as equal citizens, to live without fear, to enjoy the fruits of our toil, to give our children every opportunity in life. That dream that we have held so long in our hearts is today the destiny we hold in our hands." Truly, such words well express the sentiments of all American revolutionaries. We should be grateful for them. Thank you. I am not an expert on music, and I know we have someone in the back. Ruby, do you want to say something about Robeson? Can you give her a microphone? Yeah. Use the microphone. Ruby, the microphone's behind you.
I made the mistake yesterday of asking Marian if she were going to talk about Florence Price and the musical side of Paul Robeson. She said, "Not really, so you can do it." And I'm not really going to talk about it, except that I am so devoted to this and feel that this is so much a part of that whole history of what we call the Harlem Renaissance. And so all I'm going to really do is send you Googling, because I think there are several of these people who are so creatively, artistically intertwined that they really need to be brought in with this fabric of what Paul Robeson represented during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So the first person is not a musician, but Langston Hughes is probably the best known writer from that Harlem Renaissance and portrayed so much of what was in the hearts and minds of people like Paul Robeson during this time. And many of his poems were set to music that Paul Robeson sang in art song recitals. And also Marian Anderson, who was part of this group as well. And so there are two composers I want you to look up and listen to their music, because they were ones who composed not only spirituals, arranging spirituals that Paul Robeson and Marian Anderson sang, but many wonderful pieces of their own. And they're both women composers. One, Florence Price, and the other is Margaret Bonds. And even they are intertwined because both lived in Chicago after Florence Price left migrated north from Arkansas. And then Margaret Bonds was in Chicago, became a student of Florence Price. Eventually, Florence Price and her two daughters, after Florence divorced, moved in with Margaret Bonds. Margaret Bonds eventually went to New York, studied at Juilliard, and so if you look up all these people with their connections with Paul Robeson, and particularly, if you can remember this, I had this on Spotify on my phone, and I left my phone on my charger when I left the house. So there's a wonderful song by Florence Price called The Dream that is based on a poem of Langston Hughes. And
A gorgeous
the actual recording on Spotify is by Thomas Hampson, who is not a bad voice at all. But if you can imagine Paul Robeson singing it, then this will give you an idea of that particular element. And then also Google Margaret Bonds and hear some of her music, because both she and Florence Price were amazing piano performers as well as composers.
Ruby, by the way, is a concert
and by the
pianist
way,
herself.
if you Google Spotify with Paul Robeson, you can hear, there are numerous songs of him. And one that I was going to play a snippet of is his singing just the words to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, All Men Are Brothers, and he starts it in English and then sings it in German. His German is just amazing, and to hear that voice, it gives you that sense of what he really was like as a Renaissance individual, because he was somebody who probably had the best voice of his time, and yet he was off doing all these things that Marion was talking about. So my 5-minute spiel on
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you.
Googling.
And now let's ask questions. Who has a question about Robeson, about anything that you heard that you're thinking, yeah, but what about this? And we're ready with a microphone to get your questions. In his book, I'll start myself. In his book, Here I Stand, did he make his political position clear?
Yes,
And-
1958.
And what was his political official position?
Well, he will never say he's a communist. I mean, again, he emphasizes the brotherhood issues, his whole being opposed to tyranny in any sort. He's at this point, it's just he's going to soon get his passport back. And I had to look to see, in case you're wondering what happened on the courts. It was an unrelated case. It was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision that restored his passport. The case was called Kent v. Dulles. I guess it was John Foster Dulles. And what the Supreme Court said is that denial of a passport without due process of law is a violation of the Fifth Amendment right to liberty. So that's what happened. But again, it was an unrelated case. Are there any other questions? And I hope I haven't bored you to tears. There's one.
Thank you. Paul Robeson's son, his wife, she was Jewish, wasn't she?
I
also?
think so, yeah.
She was? So was there any involvement or connection to the Jewish community?
Not that I'm aware of, but I didn't really research his wife. His son died about 2014, 12 years ago.
Okay, and they have a grandchild, or their child was that, I don't know if it was a man or a woman, but are they still involved in activism of some sort?
I just don't.
Okay.
Again, I didn't. Again, this whole volume of his life was so amazing that I was just more interested to see about the son's death and his son was more of an engineer type. Although he was also a political activist and also wrote a 2-volume biography of his father.
Okay. Other questions? Did I see a hand up over here a minute ago? Maybe not.
Let me ask. By 1976, he still had not at all soured on communism?
Not real. I mean, again, because he felt so discrimination, but we don't really. Again, he didn't appear much in the last really 10 years of his life. So he didn't really say too much, and so, who knows exactly. He lived with his sister. His sister was widowed at that point. Her husband was a doctor. You could see it was a very nice home. So that's pretty much what happened. But I don't think there's no reason to think that he did. But again, you have the period in the 76 of, for a while, détente, and then things start heating up again with Afghanistan a couple of years. But that was several years later.
Yes? Oh, a question back here.
Okay, we have a question from the chat. What are the names of the musicians who were Paul's contemporaries?
Ruby, I'm going to guess. Who were the?
Marian Anderson is the first answer. Let me bring this closer. Repeat those if you would.
Margaret Bonds and Florence Price, I mentioned before. Harry Burleigh was another important person in the spiritual arrangement composer field. And then eventually Leontine Price became someone who sang some of these same songs that were part of this same tradition.
Harry Belafonte was a pallbearer at his funeral, too.
All right, let me ask our folks over here, do we put away chairs tonight or leave them? Oh, it makes things easy. So as we're wrapping things up, one last chance to ask a question. If not, don't forget to take your phones off of airplane mode. And thank you all for turning out tonight. We've got 3 more of these Tuesday Talks ahead.